This is a conversation I had with Andrés Gómez Emilsson, who's a psychedelic researcher from the Qualia Research Institute. Andrés has a master's degree in computational psychology from Stanford and a professional background in graph theory, statistics, and effective science. So he's a pretty smart guy. Previously, he co-founded the Stanford Transhumanist Association, and his current role is as co-director of research over at Qualia. Now, this is the second time I've spoken with Andrés. He was actually one of the very first guests I ever had when I started this channel, and he's such an interesting guy to talk to because he approaches the subject of psychedelics in a way that is very different from the usual discourse. Now, obviously, Andrés is coming at it from a scientific angle, but it's not in any way kind of dry or reductionist. In fact, I find his ideas much more mind-blowing than the usual concepts which have been floating around since the days of Terence McKenna. And the enthusiasm and the heart he puts into his work, it really sucks you in. So if you're looking for a fresh perspective on what is happening during a psychedelic trip, then there is plenty here for you to get your teeth into, and I found it fascinating. For anyone who's interested and wants to get involved, then Qualia have created some web-based tools which use to simulate the various aspects of a psychedelic experience. And by using these tools, the kind of data they get from them really helps them out with their research. So I'll leave some links in the description below. Go and check that out. There was a couple of minor technical issues during this conversation, so there are a few places where the conversation jumps, but it's nothing major. Honestly, I absolutely love talking to this guy, and without any further ado, I bring you Andrés Gómez Emilsson.
Andrés, it's good to see you, mate.
Likewise, great to see you. It's been a while.
It has, man, and it's crazy. It's like been 18 months I think since we did that last talk, and the world has just changed around us. You know, it's a lot of stuff going on. So, I mean, a lot of stuff I think we can get into. But I guess just as a sort of a good little icebreaker and a way of sort of introducing yourself to anyone who's not seen that previous one. Mate, maybe just introduce yourself in your own words. Who is Andrés Gómez Emilsson?
Sure. So I would say that I am somebody who is deeply afflicted by hyperphilosophia, meaning that it's
holy shit, that's the best intro line ever.
Yeah, I mean, meaning that I have a very hard time focusing on things other than, just wondering about consciousness, the nature of reality, why we're here. It's very much of an obsession. And thankfully, over the years, I've been able to craft a career path where somehow, that illness is actually compatible with what I do day to day, which definitely wasn't the case for many years. I used to work as a software programmer, data scientist, but I found that if like 6 out of the 8 hours I was working a day, I was just thinking about consciousness. Like maybe that wasn't exactly the best career path. So I guess like more broadly, I'm currently the co-director of research at the Qualia Research Institute, which is a nonprofit that co-founded with Mike Johnson and Romeo Stevens, and right now we are about like 8 full-time members, and there's like about like 12 volunteers or so, and it's really picking up steam. We have like a lot of really fascinating projects. I'd be happy to talk about some of them, but obviously one of the things that intersect with your type of work is basically kind of like basically trying to formalize the study of exotic states of consciousness, basically figuring out ways of saying meaningful, non-trivial things about them. And that's something that, it's really exciting. And I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, it turns out.
Sure. So just expand a little bit on what you said there. So with Qualia Research Institute, this is the kind of, in layman's terms, you could say called like, psychedelic, although not strictly psychedelic, but look, those kind of states of consciousness, this is what you research as a team together. And I think you've got a couple of different channels that you kind of talk about that stuff on. So you have the Qualia's own channel, and then your own YouTube channel where you started doing a lot of these kind of like really expanding sort of blog posts where you really sort of deep dive into these subjects in very unique ways, Andrés. I find your channel absolutely fascinating. So I'm really going to try and keep up with you and pick your brains on some of these things. And I'd really just like to dive. Let's not fuck about, mate. Let's just get into the condoms, right? This is what we need to talk about. Because just for the benefit of my audience, you put together a video where you were talking about consciousness, explained as different bubbles of consciousness. And I don't know if you did bring any props, but you kind of explained it via the medium of contraceptives, which I thought was just pure genius.
Yes, actually, let me, not a condom, but an actual balloon. Let me get one. Just 1 second.
Go for it. Yeah, please do. Just going and grabbing some balloons, but it was actually when he did it last time with condoms, and it just kind of, I don't know, there was something very amusing about explaining the deepest mysteries of consciousness via prophylactic sheets. So yeah, but anyway, he's going getting a balloon. I've got a better balloon. Just wait this. I'm gonna whatever balloon he's got is about to get on. I'm hoping he can't hear this.
Yeah, actually, a friend of mine, right after that video, he mailed me a bunch of actual balloons so I could.
Well, I've got to give you a bit of a warning, Andrew, because I think there might be a bit of a pissing contest about to start, because I can see you've got a balloon there, and there's a wonderful bit of synchronicity just happened. I shit you not, in the world today. So I went to the grocery store this morning to pick up some condoms for this thing, so we could both condom things out, and there was a balloon guy, like a clown balloon guy, making balloons. So whatever you've got, I've got. So this for tonight, this is going to represent my consciousness, and we can bend it in all sorts of ways.
Oh,
so
beautiful.
yeah, let's see your balloon, Andrew. What have you got?
Oh, no competition. I'm not gonna try to compete with yours for sure.
So yeah, I mean, I'll use mine then, but feel free to play with your little balloon. But yeah, I mean, perhaps I don't want to sort of mansplain too much your own theory, but do you want to sort of talk through what's going on with the balloons and the theories of bubbles of consciousness?
Definitely. So, I mean, it sounds trivial, but actually, I think it's very, very deep, and it's kind of difficult to explain otherwise. But basically, there's this whole problem, in philosophy of mind, in neuroscience. It's called the binding problem, and basically, what it says is, how is it possible that like 100 billion neurons that are spatially distributed can simultaneously contribute to a unified experience? And there's all kinds of explanations. Some people talk about it in terms of like implicit information processing. Some people believe that it has to do with like the synchrony of the neurons. There's also kind of like accounts and resonance and so on. But I've got to say, like, none of those explanations actually work. Because you can, if it's like synchrony between neurons, then there's stochastically always going to be neurons, let's say, in your brain that are like firing in synchrony with those in my brain. So like clearly synchrony alone is not enough to kind of like create these, what you might describe as an ontological unity. So instead, I think like the right way to approach it is actually putting it on its own head, and rather than saying you start with a reality that is made of a lot of tiny atoms, and then the question is how do they come together into bigger units, you actually start out with a unified reality, which would be the universal wave function of quantum mechanics. I mean, I know this sounds very, very woo, but I'll...
Okay, easy, man, easy. So when you talk about this universe, is this you're talking about the self-contained experience that is, say, a person? Is this what you mean, or
actually larger? Talking about the entirety of the universe, and it's even crazier because the wave function, it's not even, I mean, people conceptualize it as kind of this probability field in 3D space, basically. And like the square of the amplitude of the wave is proportional to the probability of finding a particle there, and like that's how people tend to conceptualize it. But if you actually look into how it's formalized, it's way crazier than that. Actually, the wave function is something that exists in configuration space, meaning that every point in that wave function contains a state for the entire universe. So that it's basically the dimensionality of that wave function is 3n, with 3 is the number of particles. So we're not talking about like the cozy 3-dimensional space we're familiar with, or not even the cozy 11-dimensional space of string theory or something like that. We're actually talking about, something that is 10 to the 70 or 10 to the 80 number of dimensions. Because each particle basically corresponds to one dimension. So, but the whole of that thing actually acts in a way as a unit, like the kind of it's all completely interconnected, and you cannot explain the behavior of that wave without taking into account the entirety of the wave, which is why in some sense, yes, it does behave as a unit. It kind of lends credibility to this notion that, fundamentally everything is extremely and deeply connected. Completely everything is entirely entangled. But then the question becomes, how come, that huge wave that encompasses the entire universe gets broken down into fundamental sections or pieces, such that, I'm having an experience right now and you're having an experience right now, and in some sense we are kind of separate. So the solution to this is what we call, basically a topological segmentation account of the binding problem. In this case, it becomes the boundary problem. How do you create boundaries in that wave function? So the metaphor here is going to be that the surface of the balloon or the condom, as the case may be, is the wave function, and it starts off completely unified. Every single point is in a sense like part of the same fundamental entity. But then, the evolution of the wave function, which is described by the Schrödinger equation, for those who are curious about it, and there's definitely some fascinating videos I can point you to that are pretty good at explaining, how the Schrödinger equation works. But basically, it not only modifies kind of like how the wave function is moving in kind of like these like smooth ways and smooth transformations, but it also can create like topological changes in the wave function. And that would be things such as like, not only deformations of the balloon, but actually, and this is not the optimal balloon to do this, but basically, like twistings of it, such that you have, basically like tiny pieces of it that are topologically segmented. And this is definitely where your balloon is going to be far superior.
I gotta say, I think I could twist mine pretty easily and sort of bend it through itself a little bit. So I guess my kind of first question there would be then, so when is the balloon all of consciousness, like the universe of consciousness, and I am one section in it? So this is potentially Rob. You can be that bit there. That could be you. And this kind of would lend into the sort of the narrative around we are all one. We are all sort of we are just the universe expressing itself. This kind of thing.
Yes, exactly. So like you are like the tiny like topological segment, and there's a couple like crazy things to elaborate here. I mean, one is that each moment of experience would be its own segment. So it's not even like, I mean, it's not the standard notion of like, a given person is kind of like a unit over time. In this view, actually, in every single second, there's like a lot of little time slices or moments of experience. And each of those moments of experience contains the subjective feeling of the passage of time. And each of those tiny segments itself, it's also kind of its own observer moment, you could say.
Yeah, I think this is probably one of those things where things like the never-ending sort of cascading fractals sort of really start making sense. Where you start diving into these number patterns, and they just keep expanding out into different. I can't remember what the name of the set is now, but and anyway, it keeps kind of going, and every time you find like one orb, that just expands out into even more things. So that's what kind of jumps to mind as you describe this, that there is this kind of just a never-ending descent, and there isn't a kind of a bottom to this. It's just the bigger sort of sphere, as it were, like the big balloon. We could divide this an infinite number of times into smaller and small things. And as you mentioned, although this is representing all of consciousness. It's also like the me would be just as complex as this, and we can like sort of bend it round in ways of interacting.
Well, I guess I've got to push back a little bit here, because in the model actually there is a finite amount of complexity to a given state of consciousness.
Okay.
I mean, and in the end, if you zoom down enough, it will become something that is essentially quantized. So in these sort of models, I mean, it's kind of crazy, but like basically the information content of a moment of experience is huge. You know, there's like so much detail in a moment of experience, but it's finite. It's not infinite. And also, I mean, crazily enough, the entirety of the multiverse, at least, you know, in this formalism with a universal wave function, also contains finite information. It's just huge. It's like an insanely large amount of information, but it's finite. And, you know, obviously the difference between something finite and infinite is infinite. So in some sense, we are still infinitesimally small relative to true infinity, which in this model maybe actually doesn't exist. I don't know. There's a lot of kind of strange paradoxes to unravel in there. But essentially, yeah, the wave function doesn't have infinite resolution. There's actually kind of like a limit to it where it starts to become quantized and you can't go further.
Yeah, I suppose the kind of the thing there, which particularly when we're talking in terms of like psychedelic experience, and we have these experiences of just incredible vastness, then I mean it feels like infinity, and so we start throwing around that kind of word quite casually. But you know, I would fully grant you that there is a difference between my blurting of infinite and the actual the real science of it. So yeah, don't worry too much about it. So let's kind of sort of delve into the kind of like the psychedelic sort of aspect of it, because I think that's a bit that's of most interest to myself, because what you describe, or what you use this sort of demonstration for, is the kind of how a psychedelic effect might manipulate this sort of, you know, these bubbles or these experiences. And I think, again, I'll have to apologize up front if I butcher what you say, but it was, again, if we had, you know, if I might be, say, 3 of these, you know, these bubbles here, then as I go into some sort of deep psychedelic state, either, you know, sort of with, say, for example, with the like 5-MeO or DMT, then these bubbles may start sort of unraveling, or within other sort of psychedelic states, then the sort of the fields of consciousness start bending through on themselves. So now they're interacting in different ways. So now information is passing across them differently. Have I got that kind of more or less?
Yeah. So I guess like to like enrich this perspective, and yeah, this is basically what I'm arguing, that one of the crazy things that happen on psychedelics is that the topological shape of your consciousness changes, and a lot of people expect only, you know, something like, oh, I'm gonna see like pretty colors, or I'm gonna, you know, maybe see like shapes or have like strange thoughts. They don't expect something like, you know, the topological configuration of my consciousness will be unraveled in such a way that the object-subject distinction will melt down. And like, it's, you know, when the object-subject distinction meltdowns, it's not, you know, that you're seeing like colors more intensely only. No, there's like some much more radical transformation that is actually taking place. And I think,
I think to say that though to somebody who's not had one of these experiences, it doesn't mean anything. So you can't. It's one of those things you can't really. It's a cliche, but you can't explain it to someone. You've just kind of like got to club them around the head with it and say, "Oh well, now you get it. Now you understand what."
Yes, it's extremely challenging for sure. And I mean, I would agree with David Pearce here, who basically argues that it is possible to generate, you know, a good language for psychedelic states. The thing is, like, we will need basically to get a lot of really smart people together and have actually all of them basically have all these experiences, and like as soon as they're back to normal, develop that language with a very, very fresh impression of what all of that was about. Because otherwise, you know, you lose it, you don't even talking out anymore. You know, with practice and kind of like a serious approach, I do think that you can retain some aspects of the experience so that then eventually, you can make it into a language, which is, I mean, basically the approach of something like trying to formalize it. I guess last time we talked about the hyperbolic geometry of DMT experiences, and that's something I would point at as kind of like an attempt at generating, scratching the surface of basically a psychedelic language. I guess.
Yeah, so I watched a recent video on that subject. It is something I'd sort of like to dive into a bit more, because I think certainly a lot of my own, issues with, when I've sort of challenged certain people on things, I think a lot of this is a language problem, and just like the example we had now with infinity, so, somebody throws around a word quite sort of liberally, somebody, means it sort of quite literally. I've actually had somebody get quite upset at me because I kind of, said that, infinitying itself is a bit of a cliche, and they would go like, well, what do you mean that's a cliche? That's like a perfectly valid description. I was like, well, it's a subjective description, but it doesn't mean anything. It's just kind of, it's this nonsense that we come out with in a poetic way, which is fine. But yeah, I think the language topic is something I'd definitely like to explore, because yeah, I think as there's a couple of things there. One is just that, yeah, the current language is just so flimsy, and yeah, just not adequate for describing these things, and the definitions are just so broad. I mean, if I take something, say like infinity or enlightenment, I can pretty much guarantee you I could ask 5 different people and get 5 different answers without fail. So it starts to become meaningless. So I mean, I do like a lot of the phrases that you throw in. There's one I think you just mentioned earlier where you kind of refer to these things as exotic states or exotic experiences, rather than kind of like altered states or something like that. And I thought I really like that one, because you can get like an altered state via sort of like meditation or via something, but some of these. This will probably get me in trouble with a certain group of people now, but when you have something like a deep DMT experience, I don't think that comes any other way. It's just so bizarre. I don't know, what would be your take there?
No, exactly. So I can explain the inspiration of why do we talk about it as like exotic states of consciousness, and it's kind of like with an analogy with physics. So like a lot of people, for example, especially people who are not like actively studying physics, there's kind of this whole question of like, wait, are particles waves or are they like points? Are they particles or waves, right? And if you go to a conference on consciousness, a lot of people are kind of obsessed with this question, and it's like, oh, the big paradox or something like that. If you look at the equations of quantum mechanics, you will say, well, it's actually something that kind of behaves like a particle and like a wave, but it's neither. It really is kind of these like packets of excitation of energy. In some configurations, they have wave-like behavior, in some particle-like behavior. But it goes even deeper than that, because let's take, for example, the helium, at room temperature, yeah, it kind of has a lot of like particle-like behavior. If you cool it down, it will become a liquid, and, interesting happens. But if you cool it down a lot, close to 0 degree Kelvin, something very weird happens where it actually becomes this liquid with 0 viscosity that just continues moving on forever. It has no way of dissipating energy, has these quantum vortices, and has 0 resistance. It climbs through walls and all of these insane things. And I would say, okay, that's an exotic state of matter, in the sense that like it has behavior that you wouldn't have anticipated. And if you thought to begin with that, oh, helium is just a bunch of particles bouncing around, this doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So actually you have to kind of take a step back and say, well, helium to begin with was being described by this, wave function of quantum mechanics. It's kind of particle-like in the context we encounter it, but really is something else. And when you cool it down, it kind of exposes that something else quality to it. And yeah, I would say the same with consciousness, that, okay, we tend to think of consciousness as this kind of like, at least in human consciousness, this aggregate of like colors and tactile sensations and auditory experiences. And those modalities are like somewhat segregated, and we have a sense of self and so on. And like, sure, you take coffee or something like that, you don't see much of a difference. It's kind of the same, but with a little bit of a paint or a slight modification. But you take DMT and all of a sudden, yeah, it's kind of these like liquid helium, like there's zero viscosity, there's kind of like things climb through walls, like, and all of these exotic effects. And generally the claim that we have at Qualia Research is that exactly the same as with physics, that it's kind of insane to think that you can derive the equations of quantum mechanics by just studying objects at room temperature. Basically, you're gonna miss out on a whole lot of phenomena that give you hints as to actually what's going on underneath the mathematical formalism. Exactly the same with consciousness. Like if you think you understand consciousness by just looking at it at room temperature, or just sober everyday life, you're missing out on actually super critical hints about like what actual kind of weird mathematical beast this is actually like.
Yeah. So I wanted to sort of talk a little bit about the DMT and also 5-MeO DMT, because I think last time we spoke, it was just after you'd put out that video on hyperbolic geometry, so that was very sort of DMT focused and the sort of the visual representation of these sort of impossible shapes. And it seems like we talked a lot more recently around 5-MeO DMT, and I've also been recently exploring 5-MeO. So which is why one of the reasons I was watching your videos with kind of interest, and also trying to put out my own stuff there about why these two things are so different. And because I think there is a misperception that 5-MeO DMT is just DMT with a sort of a slice of lemon in it, and yeah, it's definitely not.
You were saying that basically, yeah, DMT has kind of these multiplications of the little bubbles in your experience, and maybe just a quick point of clarification. Just so with the condom metaphor, basically, I mean, at the highest level, basically, there's this difference between internal boundaries and external boundaries. So basically, I would describe, when you have like this twisting, that basically the pinch point will correspond to a global boundary, in a sense that like anything that is outside of it, you simply cannot experience, and you might be this like tiny little bubble here. But then there's also internal boundaries, which is kind of like the bubble itself is pinched, and also something you could probably do way better with yours. But like basically, it's like, yeah, if you kind of like take these two extremes, and they kind of like get pinched in the middle. There's kind of like this internal boundary. So basically, there's like this additional point through which lines can move around. And internal boundaries in this model is what holds a lot of the information in your experience. And I would definitely say that on DMT, for example, you will have these like chaotic unraveling of a lot of more internal boundaries. Like, it's not only going to be a sense of separation, kind of like the self-object divide. There's going to be like, a self-hyper-object divide. And there's going to be a lot of tiny little segmentations, and kind of people even talk about like brains, BRANES, like kind of like brains or foliations in the multiverse. So we're kind of like traveling between dimensions or crossing the veil, a lot of things like that to me suggest the generation of a lot of like new exotic types of internal boundaries. Whereas as a very generic effect, 5-MeO DMT essentially smooths out and unravels the internal boundaries. So you actually get rid of them. And
let's just stick with normal, if the word applies, DMT for the moment. So do you think is that what accounts for things like the infamous entities? Is it that as new twists are appearing in a new sort of information is now passing in new ways because things are getting folded? Is this why you think we are having separate or what feels like separate instances of intelligence, where it's actually just our current experience, but in new ways?
Absolutely. So let's talk about briefly this thing I've mentioned in many of my videos, but it seems to me like maybe actually one of those things that sober people or drug naive people can still understand, but it's really, really essential for our life, which is basically this whole concept of attention field lines. So the idea is that, okay, yes, your experience is kind of this balloon shaped with a surface, and the the idea is that actually that surface has kind of a hair. I mean, mathematically, you might describe it as, you know, a vector field, and there's a lot of like little vectors like pointing out, or like, you know, little hairs. And basically where the hairs guide you is where your attention flows. So basically the shape of your experience is going to determine kind of like how this river of attention is moving around. And a very general property, basically your attention is going to be moving towards the more salient or the more unexpected side of your experiences. Although this is not true in every state of consciousness, but as a general rule. So, and it's something also that you can manipulate. So like, even if you put your, you know, generally speaking, there's going to be a lot of attention in the center of your vision, but it's not always the case, because even if you're, you know, looking at the center of your vision, you can ask your brain to pay attention to the side. You know, like somebody is like suspicious to the side or picking up your check or whatnot. You're still having a conversation with somebody, but you can still pay attention to what's going on to the side. So that would indicate that the attention field lines are somewhat reorganized, such that at least a big chunk of your experience is kind of like pointing to what that other region. And roughly speaking, the attention field lines tend to converge in narrow areas, like small regions. There's also kind of these vortices where like they kind of like spiral into a particular region. But even with meditation, you know, without like any psychedelics or anything, you can manipulate a lot these attention field lines. Like if you do one of these exercises of quote unquote moving your energy in one place or another, really what you're doing is manipulating your attention field lines such that your attention concentrates in different regions of your experience. And in my interpretation is that all of these like, you know, energy work that you do in meditation and yoga and so on is different types of combing of the attention field lines. And you know, if you do it a lot, essentially you can make the attention field lines very straight, very symmetrical, very smooth. And that's what it feels like to have quote unquote clean energy channels. In a sense, you're having these smooth attention field lines where attention can flow without resistance. And roughly speaking, you know, the shape of our experience is such that no matter how you comb the attention field lines, they will tend to concentrate at specific points. And mathematically, there may be like very deep reasons why. Like, for example, in a sphere, there's this theorem called the hairy ball theorem, which is that if you have a vector field on a sphere and you try to comb it, no matter how you comb it, it will always have like a vector like sticking out somewhere. Whereas if you do the same thing with a torus, you can actually comb it such that there's no vector sticking out. Everything is kind of like pointing kind of like in circles or something like that. And very roughly speaking, a very big difference between 5-MeO-DMT and regular DMT is that regular DMT multiplies kind of these concentration points of attention field lines, such that like, yeah, you will have kind of the standard self, but also you have kind of these additional points where your attention will be concentrated around you. And that will feel at times like entities and like external objects and very concrete, you know, things with boundaries that feel very, very concrete and very difficult to, essentially it's impossible not to pay attention to them because they're made of these bundles of attention in and of themselves. Whereas on 5-MeO-DMT, the generic effect is that you change your shape and then it gets combed. In our language, it gets annealed using the language of metallurgy. Basically, by heating up these field lines and cooling them down, you can basically comb them and organize them in a smooth, symmetrical way. And so a lot of the 5-MeO-DMT experiences of dissolving the self-other boundary, we interpret them as basically having no places where the attention field lines are concentrating. So it feels like these like smooth, quote unquote, infinite space because there's no places where the attention is contracting. It's all basically completely smooth and without resistance, almost kind of a non-viscous field of attention.
Yeah, I think it's a good explanation. It certainly fits, I think, with the feel of, you know, normal DMT, regular DMT. what I find interesting, I don't know if you've had this experience yourself, is that I think most people have experienced the craziness of DMT, where it's all the, this feeling of everything just goes into parallel universes and you're having all these multiple experiences and it's just rapidly flashing, all this symbology appears and it's just absolutely insane in like the best possible way. But then there are moments where it does seem to come together, and I've certainly had feelings where everything just seems to just click into place and have these very, feelings of, oneness, God, those type of experiences. And I think this difference, what I perceive between that and 5-MeO is 5-MeO just does that from the get-go. So I don't know, is there anything there that, how would you, is that just a feature of DMT that it can do that, or is it just so random that sometimes it all clicks into place? Or
well, it's fascinating, but yeah, basically there would be two competing forces, and the most moments of experience on a DMT trip are not going to be these moments where everything clicks. That is going to be a kind of stochastic and like sometimes kind of like lucky state of affairs. So you can absolutely bias your experience to make it way more likely that happens. And especially if you meditate a lot, if you're like a long-term meditator, or like if you meditate for several hours before an experience, that will drastically increase the chances of inhabiting those spaces for longer. But there's still going to be some fundamental differences between those spaces and the 5-MeO DMT state. So another paradigm, and I mean, these are like different, you could think of it as like different, not different sides of the same coin, because that would be just two sides, but like different facets of a jewel that is very high dimensional, we could say.
A 20-sided dice for all you Dungeons and Dragons out there.
Perfect. Yes. The other, yes, a 20-sided dice. So one of them, is like the attention field line. The other one is the topology. And then another one is how big are the clusters of synchrony. So as a very rough approximation on 5-MeO DMT, it feels like the average synaptic path length, that is to say, like how difficult it is for two arbitrary neurons to start talking to each other and synchronize. On 5-MeO DMT, that becomes super easy. So like whatever is going on in your stomach and in your feet and in your scalp and in your hands, they can all start to pulse together. And that happens really quickly. I mean, it's a matter of like a few seconds that at first there's a bit of chaotic movement, but quickly they start to synchronize. Whereas on DMT, it doesn't go that far. So like rather than having like, hey, the top of your scalp is going to synchronize with your feet. I mean, it can happen, but like what's going to be more typical is that there's going to be patches of your experience that are synchronizing as a patch. And then you quickly start this crazy evolutionary process where different patches of synchrony are going to try to form coalitions in order to survive, in a sense. Because for those patches of synchrony to survive, they need to basically attract your attention. So it's kind of this insane hyperdimensional kind of Instagram sort of thing where all of these different structures, are basically trying to bid for your attention, create the most salient, most shocking, surprising, insightful configurations, such that you pay attention to them and you feed them with energy, which again would be with an attention field line concentration. And but because of the kind of the synaptic path length is not that large, this doesn't usually lead to a process with all of your experiences synchronizing. So the moments of hypercoherence, as I might describe them on DMT, they're basically kind of these consilience points. It's kind of like you have all of these different factions of synchronization, and they manage to kind of like arrange themselves in a weird sort of way that they're compatible with each other. So you may, the God experience on regular DMT is going to be something like there's a floor that is kind of more or less harmoniously synchronized with the ceiling, with the walls. And then maybe at the ceiling, there's this blinding white light. But the blinding white light, if you pay attention to it, is also made of a lot of grids superimposed with one another. and it's not perfectly smooth. Basically, it still has kind of these like tiny symmetrical irregularities. And a lot of it is basically going to feel kind of these like overlapping of like mesh patterns. And yeah, that can be very unitive, and I think like probably very, very therapeutic. It can be very blissful, very amazing, but it's not super stable. But I mean, you can sort of stabilize it, but it's never, ever going to be perfectly smooth, simply because the patches of synchrony are just not that large. Yeah. So like ends up being kind of somewhat no matter what.
Have you got any sort of thoughts around what changes there with something like ayahuasca? Because that certainly does have a feel of a more kind of sort of unified experience. It's not quite as random and chaotic as the vape thing. So is that just something to do with the kind of the route of administration, or do you think that's something in the other compounds that's making a difference there?
It's I mean, I can speculate. I would say there's like two main reasons why in ayahuasca is like somewhat different and somewhat more unitive than just vaporized DMT. One is the length and the speed at which the energy increases in the kind of this framework of, you know, the energy and complexity landscape. So with a more slow come up and more kind of like steady high and like more slow come down, annealing processes basically are given more of a chance to happen. Okay. So you can kind of like be very still, and you will see kind of this evolutionary process just not be rushed. So like rather than what evolving and like, you know, catching your attention being just like super shocking and weird and like disturbing or insightful or whatever, the patterns that actually kind of like catch your attention are going to be things that are just more globally consistent, because you kind of have more time to curate them, and the energy slowly builds up. So you're not just like, propelled to this like super high energy state. And I think that is a big component of it. So I would classify that as like annealing effects. And as a very general rule, the longer a state lasts and the slower the onset is, the deeper the annealing effects are going to be. So, I mean, as a very general rule, I expect, for example, LSD states to be things that give rise to more enduring changes in your state of consciousness, as opposed to mushrooms. Although mushrooms can also do it, it's just the length of it will basically allow the patterns to kind of like go deeper and be more consistent with the entirety of your nervous system. But the other thing is these MAOI inhibitors are psychoactive on their own.
Sure.
And one of the things is that people who take them on their own, basically they say they have kind of this pleasant body load component. And usually in our frameworks, what that means, basically when you have kind of like a pleasant body load component, that in our framework, it indicates low frequency consonance, basically in the paradigm of the symmetry theory of valence. What that means is like you can almost think of your body as kind of like now having these large checkerboard patterns of excitation and inhibition. And if they're organized symmetrically, that's going to feel pleasant. And basically, that will provide kind of an additional constraint that basically gives buckets where the DMT structures and fractals can unravel. And these like bucketizing will basically make it more organized, allowed to basically form more symmetrical and integrated states. So, and the same would happen with other things. I mean, like I'd expect that even vaporized DMT trips generally might have a little bit more of kind of a global consistency if you are high on weed right before embarking on it, simply because the weed high will also have kind of this similar property of providing kind of this scaffolding for the experience to be more integrated.
So I think the way I sort of visualized or what we just sort of described in your videos is that the sort of the regular DMT sort of experience, it gives rise to this kind of, you know, this kind of like experience arms race kind of thing. All these little sort of new bubbles of experience start appearing. They all start sort of collaborating or trying to, like I say, vie for bits of your attention, and that's why you get the ultra weird, super parallel universes, which again is very awesome. But there is all kind of like an ordeal element to getting there, I think, before it all levels out, and which I think is why people get so afraid of DMT, because that first leap to get there is just weird beyond weird. Whereas 5-MeO, I think, is the opposite, and I think the term you just used was kind of dissolving. It doesn't fizz up in the same way. You really just do kind of like, you know, the phrase I just have, this kind of like orgasm of consciousness. Like it just kind of, yeah, it just becomes this experience of pure isness, which is, yeah, absolutely sort of incredible, but very, very different to the normal DMT. So whenever I've been listening to a few of your videos, and it seems like I don't know, I want to sort of ask, like, is this something you seem to have more of I don't know if preference is the right word, but you see more use or more of a practical application around 5-MeO than you sort of would around normal DMT?
Absolutely. I mean, it obviously depends on the application, you know, but I would expect that in terms of transformational power for humanity, how much is going to help, you know, heal depression, heal anxiety, how much is going to help actually creating, you know, pockets of, you know, peace in the world. 5-MeO DMT, I see huge potential. And also I think like there's going to be a lot of fascinating experimentation on how to, I mean, it's like, I do expect, for example, 5-MeO DMT to be useful for grammar, for example,
really?
as opposed to like DMT. Yeah. Now, the way I envision this is basically something like, together with a 12-week mindfulness meditation program or something like that, where like maybe in week 6 you introduce very tiny microdoses, like 0.5 milligrams or something like that, carefully dosed with vape pens. Now they call them Jaguar. Basically this, doing it really right with like very low probability of like accidentally overdosing grandma, which you don't want to do that. And basically, as the mindfulness course would continue, maybe towards the end, people might be getting towards like 2 milligrams or like maybe up to 3 milligrams.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like in those doses, combined with like a meditation or like yoga practice or something that is also kind of in the somatic level, trying to realign your attention field lines, I would expect massive effect sizes when it comes to things like treating depression, treating anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
Conflict resolution, treating trauma. Whereas regular DMT is just too weird. And I mean, the one way in which I see therapeutic value in it, which I personally, I mean, like, is not something that would help me in particular because of my belief structure and whatnot. But it's, yeah, when somebody is convinced that God exists and there's a plan, and kind of like this more conceptual thing that like, oh, like life is truly significant, or like truly we're all brothers and sisters, sons of gods, or something like that. But the experience itself, the texture, the texture of that experience, I don't think it really vibes very well with the native rhythms of our body. It's really kind of this weird, quasi-crystalline, exotic, high-dimensional thing that I don't think is very healthy for your nervous system as such.
Yeah, I think you had a phrase of like it was a nervous hand grenade or something like that.
Oh yeah, so, it's a hand grenade for your epistemology, meaning that it completely messes how you make sense of the universe, and it makes you. I think that's an important distinction in one of the articles I've written, which is the difference between overfeeding and underfeeding. That underfeeding in data science and statistics basically means when you're using a model that is very simple, like if you have like a lot of dots in a scatter plot, and clearly the dots are making kind of this wiggly shape, and you just draw a line. It's like, oh, the correlation is like, well, sure, the correlation might be positive, but there's kind of this pattern that you're clearly missing. You're just not trying to make sense of it. And I think 5-MeO DMT, if you do it a lot, it underfits everything. You just say things such as like, we are all God, and that's the only thing you need to know.
Yeah.
You know, like that's the one truth, and you don't have to go deeper because that's the ultimate. And like, come on, man, there's also physics and there's also biology and all of these like very rich information you cannot discard. Or like how to get rid of chronic pain, like knowing that your God is not enough for that, and so on. Whereas
blasphemy.
Yeah. And whereas 5-MeO, whereas like regular DMT will overfit. So basically, if you have all these like scatter dots in a plot, DMT will make you trace the strangest curve that hits on every single dot.
Yeah, I think this
even
is why
though the curve,
it
resonates.
Yeah, I think it's why it resonates so much with like there is, I think, a correlation between, you know, a certain level of psychonauts and the conspiracy crowd, because they're looking for that kind of complexity, and they are joining the dots. Just, I think in defense of an NDMT, because it does have like a special place in my heart. I think that what the value of it is and it's not to be flippant or dismissive of it, but I would say for the vast majority of my experiences, it's just been just pure awesome. And as someone in their mid 40s, you know, who works a sort of a 9-to-5 job, and you know, a lot of us get stuff kind of like piled upon their shoulders, to just get smacked upside the face and just have the absurdity of hyperspace revealed to you, and just to be able to say, oh my God, I was just so lost in my own bullshit. That's incredible. and I think that's got its own value. That kind of hyper fun is yeah. I definitely think it can be abused, which I think then does lead into this kind of, you know, very conspiracy minded, seeing connections are not there. But as a kick in the ass, I think it's pretty unstoppable. Whereas I think I would definitely agree that I think 5-MeO has a much deeper or much higher ceiling, therefore the work you can do with it. But like, holy shit, that like to say that it pulls the rug out from underneath you would just be a gross understatement, because yeah, there is no rug in that. And I think that sort of ties in kind of nicely to, like, you know, what we see with some people within this space, because it's one thing that, and I've been having a conversation with my wife about it, and she's been like, she's never done 5-MeO, but she's curious because I have, and she's heard me talk about it. But then she sees certain sort of figures within the sort of psychedelic community who are very pro 5-MeO, and not in particularly attractive ways, or in ways which seem extreme. And so like their beliefs, not only like what you just described, of where they just collapse everything into sort of everything is oneness or everything is God, but they might take that to more extreme things. I've seen this in some Bufo practitioners, where they start incorporating fairly extreme practices into their Bufo things, you know, stuff like almost taking people to sort of near-death experiences. And then some people who incorporate that into their sort of practices. There's some that's going around in sort of psychedelic circles at the moment of, you know, how should you facilitate, say, a 5-MeO experience? And some facilitators get very hands-on and sort of doing stuff which some people might find weird. So I guess, like, what's your thoughts around that? Is there something intrinsic within 5-MeO that gives rise to what I would consider to be sort of like ego-inflated characteristics, which is kind of the opposite of the kind of all is one sort of thing? You got any opinion on what's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I want to address basically it seems like the two main points. One is kind of in defense of DMT, and the other one is what's going on with 5-MeO ego inflation. So just briefly on in defense of DMT, I will point out, like, 100% that in terms of understanding the fine level structure of the universe, and like the quest for super intelligence, and like, I guess when I talk about super intelligence, I actually talk about like something much broader than just, what people in my circles would talk about, like AGI, artificial general intelligence or something like that, which oftentimes like sounds kind of like a ultra super hyper Asperger's type of intelligence that like, can do incredible mathematical, feats, but doesn't know what salvia is like or something like that. Whereas I think that actually like full general intelligence entails knowing the entire state space of consciousness. And that's actually where the nectar is. Like why it's so interesting to have super intelligence is because you can explore things like DMT and understand what is going on. And one of the things that just to show like, how truly I believe in this is that one of the projects I look forward to probably at the end of this year or more likely in 2022 is going to be basically going to a country where DMT is legal, probably Brazil or Italy or Costa Rica, and assemble a group of mathematics PhDs and physicists and visual artists and long-term meditators, and basically spend a couple of weeks just exploring each of the levels of the DMT and discussing the mathematical properties of them and kind of creating this codex of all of the objects that exist in that space and their mathematical properties. And I mean, I'm super excited about this. And I expect that to have like, thousands of pages because it's, kind of like exploring this completely alien world. And like, people come back and say there's weird things in there, but like, we don't have like a catalog of like what are like all of the things in there. And I think it's doable. I think it's just where there's a will, there's a way. And you just need a lot of smart people really wanting to do it, and it will happen. And, making computer animations of all of these properties and so on. And I think that kind of project really will advance our understanding of consciousness, and it will also advance our understanding of what intelligence can even be. And for sure, I expect the regular DMT types experiences to really contribute to the super intelligences of the future that we will basically create or modify ourselves to be. Whereas 5-MeO DMT, I consider it way more in the space of just valence. Is like, okay, what is the math of bliss? What is the math of loving kindness? Peace. Like, what is that? And like, in some sense, I do think that's more relevant for the average person. Like the average person doesn't really need to know what a DMT breakthrough is like. It might probably just confuse the heck out of them. But they can probably benefit from the immense peace of a good 5-MeO DMT session. Now, I guess like, to address the second part, of course, I mean, I was utterly shocked and incredibly disappointed to see, basically the abuses that I've and you've talked about in your channel as well of, I mean, things that I consider like unspeakably horrible, like putting water in somebody's throat as they like, things that are like insane. Like there's really no words to describe how, I mean, I wouldn't use the word evil lightly, but like that is like as close to like very close to hyper evil stuff I can imagine, like messing up with people's trips. And from my perspective, like 5-MeO DMT is something that not only should be done in an extraordinarily respectful way towards the participant, and basically whoever is taking 5-MeO DMT, my sense is that whatever that person wants should be done. I mean, at that point, they are what I call a utility monster. I mean, like their experience has the capacity of generating so much pleasure and so much suffering that like I don't care, if you have a toothache or whatever, like it's not comparable to what is going on with a person on 5-MeO DMT. So I think of them as utility monsters. You really should pay attention to their well-being and do everything you can for it. I mean, broadly speaking, I do expect that there's going to be kind of like a whole science of it that like, okay, what is the best way of like titrating the dose? Is it perhaps like a gradual increase of like 10 milligrams over 20 minutes? Like I expect like these very slow come ups to basically be the things that maximize the chances of a really good state. Very gentle music, a lot of meditation beforehand, a lot of these preconditions to just really maximize the chances of a super beneficial state of consciousness. And I do, I guess, regretfully tend to think that, yeah, basically practitioners are like very, very on hand with it. It's more of a projection or like ego issue that is that is going on.
I think a part of it's the kind of carryover from the traditional or the shamanic stuff, which again I absolutely love. I'm a big fan of things like ayahuasca ceremonies, but there isn't really that tradition around something like 5-MeO. It is a kind of a fairly new thing, but a lot of these practitioners are putting those same kind of, or injecting those same kind of, what seems like traditional practices of maracas in your ear or lots of water being splashed around and stuff like this. And yeah, it seems very unnecessary. I saw there's a great documentary. I talked to the guy who directed it a couple of weeks ago, but it's called Before Various Reloaded, and they have a couple of sort of facilitators in there, and I really like what these guys were saying, which is, really just be as kind of hands off as possible. Just be there for what the person needs you to be. But yeah, definitely don't be pushing your own sort of ego or like stir too much. Even that was in one thing. Don't stir too much into their eyes, just in case they start associating you with being some sort of savior figure. Yeah. And I think that's the kind of the mentality and the framework that we need to be looking at this experience, because it's not the same as kind of ayahuasca, where with something like ayahuasca, I do find that sort of shamanic, the tradition around it, it's quite comforting and to have that kind of framework through it. But it's just a whole different kind of worms to the to the 5-MeO experience. So yeah.
Just to quickly interrupt you there. Sure. I do think there's like, I mean, even from a theoretical point of view, that like, if you talk about like basically DMT as this much more chaotic competition between clusters of synchrony, it actually makes sense that because of the chaotic nature of that experience, having like a metronome, like basically music or something that kind of like gives you kind of like this totem or this like center point around which to organize it, actually can be really beneficial, and in that sense increase the chances of this unitive quality. Whereas 5-MeO DMT, already the natural attractor of your nervous system left alone will be that like unitive state. So it's almost kind of if you add an additional metronome outside of you, it's going to perhaps even have dissonance with the internal.
Yeah, it does. I've actually had that experience, and yeah, what I found like is a sort of background music. You really want some kind of something, well, not too intrusive for a start, but something very kind of swirly and something that you can't lock onto. Makes much better. Whereas I did it one time with like sort of shamanic kind of Icaros, so there was like a definite beat to it of a sort of one of these grass rattles, and I found that quite discordant. It didn't gel well with the experience. So I mean, I think the whole boundary dissolution thing fits with whatever the sort of the background noise is going on.
Yeah.
Whereas I guess with the DMT space, it's kind of the opposite. It like say, I think it helps synchronize things a lot more.
Exactly. Like if it's not broken, don't fix it. Like the silence is just good enough on 5-MeO DMT for most people.
So what do you think about the putting aside the kind of like the dangerous sort of practices, but the of the sort of this mentality that we talked around earlier of just collapsing everything down into the sort of we are all one, and seeing this taken to sort of in itself taken to fairly extreme examples. And I know one that we've got in common, because you've done an article on the person, and as have I, and I'm not going to wail on the guy at all, but got to mention it is Leo Gura, who I'm going to give some credit to Leo. He did some, I think he's done some very interesting sort of work with 5-MeO, and I would never take anything away from his subjective experience or his sort of courage in facing those subjective experiences. My only issue is the kind of the conclusions he gets out of them, but I've flogged that horse to death. But I think even just within that kind of those subjective experiences, you can end up in these kind of problematic areas of thinking, well, I'm now manifesting everything. It's because everything is one, then everything must be me, and so I'm sort of I think you can end up in some problem states. So what would be the kind of the map here going forward? So I'm just with this conversation that we're having, I'm thinking that people are going to be interpreting, right, so we are all the balloon and the balloon is all one, so we can just untangle the balloon and then we're all just this pool of slime and the universe is all slime and I manifest as slime and okay. Untangle that one, Andre.
Yes, well, I mean, you don't have control over how, like, you know, what's going on in the balloon way over in Mars, for example. I think like the Schrodinger equation is still going to apply to what's going on over there, just as it's going to apply in your case. It's just that you're kind of like loosening up the constraints to some extent, and again, like kind of with a reference to liquid helium, you're becoming a internally unified state with no internal boundaries, and that gets the feeling of like basically gets to the feeling of being merged with the cosmos. But and yeah, basically this feeling of a complete control over reality, I think is more of a overextension of what's actually going on, which is complete control over your own experience, you know, which includes a representation of the rest of reality. I recently had a chance to interview somebody who actually contacted me because he read the article on Leo Gura, and then he said, hey, like I actually have experimenting with 5-MeO DMT as well, in an even more extreme way, which is that he used it every day for 6 months rather than just 1 month, and also like in very substantial doses. And now he's a very fascinating guy. Like he's like very much of a technical guy, but what really struck with me is that you know, he has like 30 years of like meditation experience. He has like a 9-to-5 job. He has like a family. He's looks very responsible and like very rational actually. And then also he has like this extreme, you know, in-depth experience with 5-MeO DMT. He also, by the way, has done something very similar with both salvia and regular DMT as well.
Like a 6 month back-to-back run.
Yeah.
This guy's a madman.
Yeah, you would imagine, right? But I was so surprised talking to him, just how sane and like normal and like non-delusional he was. Like he was saying like, yeah, you know.
Can I just ask, where was he on the kind of spiritual spectrum then? Was he sort of did he see this purely as exotic experiences, or was he kind of more leaning towards this means something sacred kind of viewpoint?
He started out more in the spiritual, I would say. And after all of these experiences, he says he is almost kind of back to square one, where he just doesn't know what they are, what these experiences are. Like he, one thing I can mention, for example, is he says like, okay, the first time he had like a breakthrough 5-MeO DMT experience, and he had in that particular case the experience of kind of seeing the most perfect light, which is one of the states, one of the attractors in 5-MeO DMT. And he said, yeah, like he got everything he wanted out of like non-duality. Like he felt like he achieved the peak state, and like everything after that is kind of gravy. Like he already achieved the, you know, he got what he wanted out of his life, he could say. But then over like many more experiences, he came to realize that, wait, hold on a second. There are many different types of experiences on 5-MeO DMT where each of them feel like the ultimate truth, but they're different. Each of them is also different. So what's going on is more complicated than like there being like this perfect ultimate truth that you experience in one way, because there's so many different variants of it. Just to kind of like illustrate it, he walked us through basically like the varieties of silence that like in some DMT experiences, he experiences like complete auditory silence, and he merges with auditory silence, which is, I guess, kind of the empty version, but of auditory qualia. In another experience, he merges with kind of this infinite void, which is visual, kind of this visual silence. Then in another experience, he merged with kind of tactile silence, which he describes as kind of a peace, that when people talk about, I feel peaceful, is actually tactile silence. Okay. So there's kind of these different attractors. There's like, you may end up in the visual silence, in the auditory silence, in the tactile silence, and they all feel like the ultimate truth. They, of course, also in our model of valence, basically any type of highly energized silence would be high valence, basically blissful experiences. And the truth is that I suspect that there's like millions of different types of experiences like that, and all of them will feel like you reach the limit of how blissful it can be. But it's kind of like almost you're climbing different mountains in a sense, like you're optimizing different regions of your experience to become that perfectly smooth symmetrical state. And depending on how you start and in what direction you move towards, you're gonna get to a different peak, a different mountain range, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that's why I have a kind of an issue with these kind of like when people start making very fundamental statements or declaring things as axioms, because inevitably they will end up having another experience and then sort of having to say, oh, well, actually, this is like the next level. You end up in this kind of Scientology model of sort of having to invent new levels. And you know, there's one way of kind of going around that, which I think is what the guy you spoke to, which is, you know, Hans. I think that's a great thing to be able to say. Actually, I'm kind of back at square one. You know, I've had to read it. I think that's a very insightful thing for him to do. Or the other thing is that you just keep doubling down and you say, oh, well, this is the new level, and you can't sort of experience this. And I don't. That's something I don't appreciate around people who go down that route, and also that it then gets tied into this kind of like, you know, what I refer to as like a pissing contest in terms of, well, you just haven't got there because you've not done it this many sort of times. It's like, well, like if I do, will you shut up? You know, it's so I always think of just that experiences are experiences, and you know, I think you have to get into some sort of like pissing contest of, well, I've done this, well, I've done that, well, mine trumps yours, no, mine trumps yours. It's like, you know, I've drank more ayahuasca than you. Well, I did more Cambo than you. Well, I've done more mushrooms. You know, oh, shut up. I think we've got to sort of certainly have respect for these individual experiences. And that's one thing I really liked about your article about Leo. I thought you took him very seriously for his subjective experiences, and you sort of put a lot of your own sort of theories into, okay, well, I think Leo's experiencing this, and I think, you know, like I say, I tip my hat to Leo for putting himself through that, and also to yourself for, like I say, for interrogating his experience so fully, and I just wish he could maybe let go of some of the kind of like the fundamental firewalls that he's built, and to sort of allow himself to be a bit more of an accessible member of the sort of like the bigger psychonaut community, rather than sort of putting himself on this pillar of like, no, I got it, guys. It's right here. So what's sort of like next on the cards for you then, in terms of your research and your sort of exploration?
Oh my gosh. Well, there's a number of things. So we are basically working towards providing very robust empirical evidence for the symmetry theory of valence, and that's still ongoing. I mean, and it's obviously like a multi-year project, but I think it might be really significant in like neuroscience and also in the psychedelic community, when we can basically point out and say, hey, like these blissful states of consciousness are basically consonant or harmonious configurations of the basically resonant modes of the nervous system, which is one of our main hypotheses. And I mean, again, like, you know, these like many varieties of silence that each of them feel blissful and they feel like the ultimate state, that kind of, goes in the direction of like, hey, these like hypersymmetrical configurations basically are the signature of peace or the signature of bliss, and so on. And for that, we are like, you know, literally right now, like we have like servers basically processing fMRI data for like MDMA, and I believe also we're gonna get pretty soon like LSD data from like some other labs that have the, you know, the permits to actually run those experiments. We're only, you could say, like doing the software side of it, basically writing the algorithms and analyzing them and trying to basically present this case. And that's a big chunk. I mean, that's a big part of this year is just getting to publish that piece of research. I mean, that also includes, I mean, it's a whole database that we are assembling of what we call like very high valence states of consciousness. Like another that is like really, really interesting is basically these things that are called fruitions, which is not in the psychedelic domain, it's just meditation.
Mm-hmm.
And they're described as basically, basically peaks of ecstasy on meditation. They last for maybe like 10 seconds or so. They're not very, very long. Basically we're getting them from like super long-term meditators that are volunteering their EEG data. And like, that's, really cool to basically analyze the EEG of that and see like, oh my gosh, actually all the brainwaves are like aligning and they look really consonant exactly when they're reporting these ecstatic states of consciousness, and like kind of the picture makes sense. So that's another big thing. We also have, I'm sure this is gonna explode. I mean, like right now it's the beginning of ways of interfacing with the nervous system in a non-invasive way, which maybe I mentioned this in our previous call in passing, but basically these combinations of light, sound, and body vibration. And, there's a lot of exploration in the past. You can read papers about like people trying to find the magical frequency, and like people, there's a whole, what I would call like the 40 hertz religion. People who say like, oh yeah, just use 40 hertz, like that's gamma waves, and and gamma is like, the mystical frequency or something like that. And, I've experimented with 40 hertz myself quite a bit, and I think there's things that are actually way better. I will mention though that if you're having like early symptoms of Alzheimer's or something like that, these like simple frequencies like 40 hertz in like light, sound, and vibration can be really helpful, because basically they provide a scaffolding. I mean, it's similar to like the DMT state, that like, okay, like if things are breaking down around you, and on Alzheimer's, basically the synaptic paths between your nerve clusters are starting to deteriorate. So kind of the trade routes of your nervous system are like malfunctioning. Adding these like constant frequency does kind of like allow it to heal and basically create new communication pathways. But if you don't have Alzheimer's, it may actually make your experience lower dimensional. That is my experience. So that like, if you're a meditator, 40 hertz actually degrades the quality of your experience. You need something
so
better.
The 40 hertz, is this just an audible thing, or is this some sort of like pulsing lights as well, or is it both? Or
is both, and also body vibration. So I can show you real quick the
Sure.
device. And there's several brands. This is just one. It's called a sub pack. I think here's the. I mean, it's a great product. I mean, it honestly is like super great product. And like, what you do is like you connect it with like an audio jack, and what it does is it's gonna take any frequencies between 10 and 200 hertz and render them in body vibration. So you put these kind of like in your chest, or you put it behind your back.
It's like what all the Call of Duty kids have got on, and these are all sorts, so they can feel the gunshots.
Yeah. That's probably the biggest market, actually. Yeah, enhancing gaming. And personally, I don't see the appeal of feeling the gunshots or something like that. Like, I don't know. I'm trying to create therapeutic things that actually, I don't know, heal you rather than anyway. But
so are you going to sort of like bundle that together and sort of is this something that sort of you or sort of Qualia will be doing, is like making a kind of a product where you would send out and it this is something that a user like myself could sort of pick up, and I would plug it in and have a sort of experience?
Exactly. Yep.
Oh, cool.
And with the intention of basically enhancing valence long term. And the type of framework that we're using is I highly recommend reading or watching any lecture by Shinzen Young. I don't know if you're familiar with him. Okay, he's a very, very no nonsense like meditation teacher. He's like really top notch, like some of the best meditation teacher you could have. And his focus is basically saying that the long-term changes that meditation do for your well-being usually are in the space of enhancing concentration power, enhancing sensory clarity, and enhancing equanimity. And of course, psychedelics also do that. They can do that. But of course, you get even more synergy if you meditate to do that, and also psychedelic experiences to do that. And with the light, sound, and vibration technology that we're developing, it's also that. I mean, it's not only to create a beautiful experience. I mean, of course, that's cool and valuable. It's more to kind of train your nervous system to enhance these properties: concentration, sensory clarity, and equanimity.
Cool. So there is actually, just randomly, one thing I did want to sort of pick you up on, and yeah, it's something about, I was listening to one of your videos the other day. I was like, okay, this is a bit of a spiky topic, and don't worry, I'm not gonna hold your feet too much to the fire, but I did just kind of want to explore it a little bit with you. It was around the you made a comment around sort of taking a little bit of, I think you called it phenibut, some sort of benzo, which is straight away the dirty word. So it's, in order to sort of level out a sort of a psychedelic experience. And there's a couple of, I think, bits that's worth exploring there. So just from my own sort of side, benzos are typically used as something like or can be used as a trip killer, that if someone's having a bad experience, that you can take a benzo and come out of it. I've heard of a few retreat centers offering this as a way of bringing people out of it. And I will admit that I have had one occasion where I was having a bad trip, and I took a benzo, and the speed at which it changed into something blissful was startling. Like, I was having a really shitty experience, and then it was just totally like, holy shit, this is amazing. Like, why don't I do this all the time? But then there's a couple of sort of problems around that thing. One is that, benzos are notoriously addictive and have all these kind of, bad qualities to them. But so I think, that's why I haven't been down that sort of route since, but I did try it at one time. The other is that, how do you think that interacts with, I guess, you could say it's the more spiritual or the more shamanic route around that. Sometimes you have to go through the shit to get the sort of the benefit. This is very typical to like something like an ayahuasca experience, where, I always tell people you should go expecting a bad time. And if you get a good time, that's a bonus, that's a cherry on top. But really, you are going there to work through your kind of struggles. And a lot of people, I think, use these things at home with that same kind of, healing mentality, whether they're actually getting the sort of healing properties or not. But certainly that's how a lot of people view it. So what's your thoughts there? I heard your statement on it, and I couldn't disagree with it, because I think your position would be something like, I think you said something like, why be a masochist or something like that. But yeah, but is there a line there between worth going through the shit and like, why would you do that? And yeah, I'd just like to, if you could expand on that a bit more for us, mate.
Absolutely. This is super critical, and I think it definitely an excellent conversation to have in a psychedelic channel. So I'm glad you bring it up. So I guess first of all, clarifying a little bit, so phenibut, it's sold as a nootropic. It is a very powerful. It is a very powerful anxiolytic. Like, it really is like strong stuff. I mean, it's kind of in the power range of like alcohol. In the, like, if you drink, 8 shots of vodka or whatever, yeah, it's gonna smash you down. You may pass out, and and so on. And of course, if you drink 8 shots of vodka every day, that's gonna be really bad for your health and your nervous system. And the same with phenibut. If you take phenibut every day, that's going to be, it's one of the worst things you could do to your nervous system. It's like very, very, very bad.
Just what does it take? What's it prescribed for? Just out of interest, I've never heard of it before.
So in the West, it's not a medically recognized substance. And it's unscheduled, and you can just literally just buy it online. And a lot of people do it. A percentage of them become heavily dependent on it. The typical case is like people will use it like once a month or something like that, and that, you know, if you use it once a month, I see no problem with it. I actually would expect it to be healthier than alcohol for the amount of euphoria and, like, you know, the comparable level of benefits that you derive from it. So
it's a recreational thing that it's used for.
In the West, at the very least. However, it was developed in Russia as an anxiolytic, and when you take it in small doses, which is the thing that I would advocate for psychedelics, which is like, so just to give you an idea, like 300 milligrams would be a kind of an anxiolytic dose. It's kind of, it just takes the edge off of like the experience. 1 gram would be the recreational dose, where like it's like, oh, you actually feel it, and you feel kind of like, you know, really, really light, and you feel really completely worryless or something like that. But it, and people, a lot of people find it like very euphoric. I will absolutely mention though that it is, well, one fun fact is like, it's actually Russian cosmonauts actually have them in their drug cabinet. Like, if you as a Russian cosmonaut are having a panic attack or something, rather than taking a benzo, which will be cognitively impairing, you can take phenibut, which is going to get rid of the anxiety, but without the cognitive side effects, which is one of the other fascinating things, because benzos are also neurotoxic. I mean, not only are they like generate dependence and like affect so many systems, they also dumb you down. They accelerate the development of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and all of these other things. Whereas there's really nothing to suggest that phenibut does the same thing. Like phenibut, I mean, maybe in heavy users, they do kind of become more like dumbed down over time. But if you take it recreationally one day, it's kind of stunning, the clarity of thinking, that like it doesn't impair your, you know, verbal skills or math skills or empathy skills or anything like that. And that's why I think, like, you know, as a psychedelic aid, is way better than a benzo, because benzo is going to degrade also the cognitive, you know, you could think of it like the fine level structure of your experience is going to be degraded by a benzo. A phenibut is not going to touch that. Phenibut is just going to reduce the anxiety, and that's it. And that's a really wonderful thing about it. And from a lot of experience reports, it does seem that taking like 300 milligrams of phenibut, something like 3 hours before an LSD trip, 3 or 4 hours before, will basically give you a very, I mean, it's going to still be like a very spiritual experience, very, very transformational. And you can still revisit your traumas and everything. I mean, it's not going to remove that component. But the one thing that will prevent is you getting stuck in endless loops of kind of the trauma just coming up and up and up and up again, basically. And that's, I think, the ideal. I mean, I can tell you like a brief story, which is I guess in the last half a year or so, I've been exploring much more deeply loving kindness meditation as kind of a regular practice, like a daily practice. And at first, I just used it as kind of like to reduce anxiety, maybe increase my performance or something like that. But I just noticed over time just how incredibly actually transformational it has been. And there was one particular trauma, and this was without psychedelics, just in meditation. There was one particular case where like an old trauma kind of like surfaced in my experience. And what happened was like the frustration of that trauma kind of like bubbled up to my experience, and it kind of like became very vivid and like just all bundled up. And it's like, okay, here is the trauma, you know, like kind of like bringing all of the stress to the surface. And then here it is, and then hit it with love, like hit it with compassion and loving kindness. And then the whole thing as a bundle transforms, and within a period of maybe half an hour or so, that trauma was like 99% gone. And like it really stayed that way. And I don't know, like I've heard things like that from psychedelics, but just meditation, I was just stunned how powerful of a transformation that was. And I think that is roughly the paradigm that at QRI we're very interested in exploring, which is getting the nervous system to bring up the trauma just enough for you to connect with it, and then heat it with a lot of love and transform it. Mm-hmm. And in that way, you're, I think, like maximizing healing and also minimizing the pain that comes with the process of healing. And something that I do worry about ayahuasca, and this is not an isolated event, people do report this, is that it can re-traumatize you, like
For
something
sure.
that yeah. So and yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of magical thinking in the space of like no, if you rough it out, man, like it's like that's the way to go. Whereas like I think of it from a physics point of view. It's like, okay, if there's this built up dissonance in your nervous system, what is the shortest path to do a mathematical transformation such that it becomes consonant? And I suspect it's something like bring it to the surface and hit it with a lot of love. I suspect that is kind of the best you can do in that space.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with what you said around ayahuasca retreats. I would say that from my experience of having been on quite a few of them, that at the very least, sort of 20%, I would say people come out there completely, for want of a better term, fucked by the experience. Just having the sort of the rug pulled out completely from under them. And I think there's a line there that we have to sort of straddle somewhere, because there is something around, there is this element within something like an ayahuasca retreat of it's all, it is almost like, an endurance contest, almost like a kind of a Spartan race-esque thing where you're just putting yourself through an ordeal. I mean, there's no way around it. It is an ordeal to hopefully sort of come out of the other side stronger. There is a lot of a lot of the kind of traditional practices do have like an element of pain in them and stuff like that. Particularly, you get into some of the sort of Native American practices and they sort of like, they're like almost 100% pain, and then sort of to bring around these kind of altered states. So yeah, there's this kind of untangling of this the sacredness and the respect for the tradition, but with the kind of like, yeah, do we sort of need to do this, or are we doing this for some particular reason? And it's a very tricky one for people to unpack. And I think I was like kind of trying to do my own little bit of meta and putting myself in the seat of some of the people I know who, like, if they'd watched your sort of podcast and they would be sort of thinking, this is like the shortcut, this is the cheat code of taking something like Phenibut, because it means something to go through this. And I've not got a sort of particular sort of line there myself. I just kind of recognized that there was this just seemed like a very complicated thing and something that would have to straddle with the kind of like the hyper science of these are the easy steps to blissful states, and the kind of what can seem quite sort of sadistic or masochistic steps that can still get you to those same states and do have this certain amount of reverence for them, but it's a very difficult one to straddle, I think.
Yeah, I can mention just a couple more things if you don't mind.
Please do.
Which is one element that I think it's important to disentangle is I mean, and I definitely don't think it's in your case. I mean, you're married and like family man and whatnot, but there's absolutely an element of almost kind of sexual signaling, like kind of being like the tough guy or the tough girl who can endure all of these states, and like you become kind of like a prized mate or something like that. And like there's definitely a lot of kind of these like tense I guess like signaling competition in the psychedelic community. It's more in the kind of like the more young people in their 20s type of thing, like who haven't like settled down, and like people who talk about like I took a heroic dose, and like they're really proud of the fact that it was a heroic dose, even though maybe
ego deaths. Yeah, it's
yeah.
I actually think a part of it is, I think there's certainly that crowd around the young ones, but I think one thing which I've noticed more in recent years is that it has moved into this age group of people around my age, in particular people in sort of corporate jobs or like sort of high power jobs, whereby something like saying I've been to an ayahuasca retreat is now a kind of a stamp in the spiritual passport, which then just gives you license to do whatever the fuck you want, because it's like, well, no, I've done this and I've healed up. Whatever issues I had were resolved by this 7 days in the jungle. So yeah, don't worry about me. I'm good as I go back to working on Wall Street and raping and pillaging sort of all countries. So yeah, I think that kind of age dynamic is shifting a little bit, or maybe it's just like people like myself who are getting older. I'm not sure.
No, that's a very interesting point of view. That like, and I think I know what you're talking about. That yeah, you get kind of this like, my cryptocurrency business model is approved by source because I came up with it on an ayahuasca retreat or something like that. And yeah, that's yeah.
Yeah, and you've seen a lot of that's something else that's a kind of interesting. Seen a lot of blending of the gurus types. So typically we had like sort of spiritual gurus, and then that kind of turned to like new age gurus, and now we have things like crypto gurus and these business entrepreneur gurus, and they mishmash all these different guruisms together to be like the spiritual crypto guru who will advise you on the ethical way to start businesses. And usually when I look at these things, I see some of the most ethically bankrupt people sort of possible. So but yet they have the stamp in the passport. They have the ayahuasca retreat under the belt, and they'll sort of use that as leverage. So yeah, it can get quite ugly, I think, in that regard.
Yeah, I almost feel now the compulsion to give a disclaimer, which is if people hearing these start perceiving me as a guru, I just gotta mention that, like, please don't think of me as a guru.
Oh no, this is a guru-free zone, mate. Yeah.
Guru-free zone. Nice. I'm a friend, a companion, maybe a counselor, maybe at best, but
well, I think what I see is with the stuff that you put out on YouTube is I think similar to, well, I'd like to think similar to sort of stuff that I do. What I'm trying to do is really to get people to have their own agency. I want people to not necessarily put blind faith in gurus, and that doesn't mean not going to teachers or just treating everything as bullshit. But I think you've got to have this kind of agency and responsibility to be able to sort of grow yourself. And that in itself is a tricky one to manage, because you can think that you have that agency because you are blindly following the guru, and you can also then get people get very defensive if you start sort of challenging certain beliefs. So it's definitely a minefield. But yeah, for sure, I think the best thing that we as a sort of psychedelic community can do is put out ideas, challenge each other's ideas, and sort of encourage that sort of agency that if you want to walk the path that I'm walking, then you're free to walk it with me. I'm not going to charge you anything for it, but don't think that I know where I'm going. I'm just going this way. But yeah, you're welcome to come with me.
Awesome. Yeah, and I guess I totally agree with that. Basically, yeah, giving people tools so that they can have their own agency on this, and exactly in that vein. I mean, basically one of the core messages of QRI, I mean, and it talks about like Pheniboot before LSD and things like that, is that we postulate. I mean, something you have to try for yourself, obviously, but we postulate that you can heal trauma with love. That you don't need to go through these like masochistic or I would almost say kind of like meaning. I mean, just as there can be like drug abuse, I also talk about there can be meaning abuse. So that like hitting the meaning hammer too much because like you're addicted to meaning. Like that's also happens, and that's a problem. And oftentimes, you take care of happiness, and the meaning of life will take care of itself. I'm a strong believer in that. And if you're resurfacing a trauma on a psychedelic experience or something like that, my suggestion would be put on some very loving music and feed love to that kind of reparent those stray patterns of your nervous system and try to integrate them. And I suspect chances are that's going to be more beneficial than a quote unquote, more meaningful, quote unquote, more shamanic approach. But, I'm just giving people the idea or the option. And for sure, in terms of our long-term interests, I'm sure a lot of people will come up with all kinds of therapies for trauma and so on, involving all kinds of elements. I do want to say that our commitment in Qualia Research Institute is that what we will put out will be enjoyable therapy. Basically, things that will feel good in the moment, will have like good effects in the short and in the long term. Basically trying to get a full package where as much as is possible, every step along the way, it's a positive experience.
And I think that's a great mission statement, and I think probably a good place for us to wrap up there, Matt. And I think I think I summarise what you just said there is, it reminds me of a quote from Sam Harris, where he was describing having one of his own psychedelic experiences quite recently, and the phrase he used was love is the ballast you want in your tanks as you go into these experiences. If you think of yourself as a kind of submarine, then just flood the ballast with love and you will just coast through these experiences. And that really resonated with me. So yeah, mate, I think that's a great place to set it up. I'd really like to thank you a lot for your time, Andrei. I loved talking to you last time. I love talking to you this time, and I hope I can talk to you again at some point in the future, mate. Big fan of your work, big fan of your channel. I'll leave some links in the description below so that people can find you. And I strongly recommend that anyone who's got an interest in the science aspects, along with the sort of the just new ways of framing, new ways of looking at these things, then check out your channel. I'm a big fan. So yeah, mate, let's show you. Leave it there and enjoy the rest of your day. And thanks a lot again, mate.
Thank you so much. I really love your channel too, and let's do this hopefully again before another 18 months. So
I'd love to, mate. I'd love to. We'll chalk something in. Stay in touch, mate.